first cause of the Iran war that began February 28, 2000 represents the most volatile tension as it threatens global energy supplies through Strait of Hormuz closure, as already military conflict between major powers, and continues with failed ceasefire negotiations despite months of economic disruption. First cause, the Iran war that began February 28, 2026 represents the most volatile tension as it global energy supplies through Hormuz closure, has already triggered direct military conflict between major powers, and continues with failed ceasefire negotiations despite months of economic disruption. June 2026, the collapse of ceasefire negotiations in Tehran on June 15 triggers Israel's preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz. Within hours, Iranian Revolution launched coordinated missile barrages acquired in Sherbetov, striking refineries and permanently shuttering the Strait of Hormuz to all commercial traffic. The conflagration spreads as mutual defense protocols, deploying naval assets to the Caspian, while China mobilizes forces in the South China Sea, transforming a regional conflict into an of global war. Prices surge past $180 per barrel. Hormuz closure eliminates 21% of global petroleum transit, while Iranian stringing Saudi infrastructure removes 12 million barrels of world markets. The economic shockwave rippled through supply chains already weakened by 3 years of post-pandemic fragility, triggering bank runs across emerging markets as currency after currency collapses against the dollar. Riots erupt in Egypt, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka as prices triple, while the Federal Reserve faces the impossible choice between hyperinflation and economic implosion. August 2026, the economic chaos unleashed market collapse becomes the perfect breeding ground for AI-generated disinformation campaigns as American vulnerability election season. Deepfake videos showing fabricated Federal Reserve emergency meetings and fake presidential addresses spread across social platforms faster than fact-checkers can respond, while synthetic audio of military commanders discussing nuclear options drives panic selling that wipes $8 trillion from global markets in a single week. The boundary between authentic crisis reporting and manufactured chaos dissolves completely and becomes a casualty of war. September 2026, Gore attacks against infrastructure, amplified by the information warfare chaos, successfully penetrate electrical grid control hubs in Texas, California, and the eastern seaboard. Later traced to Iranian proxy groups leveraging AI-assisted social engineering that exploited the disinformation environment. Blackouts affecting 47 million Americans during peak hurricane season. Emergency response systems fail as backup generators run dry after 3 days, while hospitals switch to manual operations as their computerized systems become unreliable in a post-quantum cryptographic transition chaos. October 2026. The infrastructure collapse creates perfect conditions for H5N1 transmission as power outages disable cold storage across the poultry supply chain, forcing emergency slaughter of infected flocks, adhering to algorithm and protocols. Agricultural workers, already stressed by economic working extended shifts during the crisis, become the first confirmed cases of human-to-human transmission in 3 separate states, within hours. The CDC confirms what virologists have long feared: the virus has acquired the genetic mutations necessary for sustained person-to-person spread, marking the officially 8th unique H5N1 pandemic, with a case fatality rate of 38%. November 2026. The predicted strong El Niño, supercharged by record ocean temperatures, unleashes unprecedented atmospheric rivers that trigger catastrophic flooding across California's Central Valley while simultaneously fueling massive wildfires. Australia and Brazil. The extreme weather backdrop of war-induced supply chain collapse destroy 23% of global grain reserves and trigger the failure of monsoon systems across South Asia. Food produces just as H5N1 pandemic halt international agricultural trade, creating a regions where 2.1 billion people face imminent famine. December 2000. 6. The global famine crisis triggers the collapse of Pakistan's government as 89 million citizens face starvation, leading to the military's seizure of the country's nuclear arsenal in a desperate bid to secure international nuclear coercion. India, already stretched thin by snow monsoon failures and H5N1 outbreak, mobilizes its forces along the Kashmir border as Pakistan threatens to deploy tactical nuclear weapons against Indian grain convoys unless immediate humanitarian corridors are established. The specter of nuclear exchange between two starving nations through global markets as the world realizes that civilizational collapse and weapons of mass destruction form a feedback loop of unprecedented lethality. January 2027, the Pakistan-India nuclear standoff triggers the complete collapse of global commodity markets as insurance companies refuse to cover any shipments through South Asian waters and airspace, while the Strait of Hormuz remains closed due to the ongoing Iran conflict. Gold surpasses $8 per 8,000 ounce as central banks declare desperate currencies that have lost all credibility in the face of supply chain apocalypse. The simultaneous failure of the Pakistani rupee, Indian rupee, and Iranian rial creates a cascading currency crisis that forces the bankruptcy. With the post-Bretton Woods financial order, such as 7 billion people require emergency food assistance. February 2027. The economic collapse amplifies existing disinformation campaigns as desperate populations become increasingly susceptible to conspiracy theories blaming specific ethnic and religious groups for the cascading crises. AI-generated deepfakes of world leaders declaring war spread across compromised social media platforms, while constant communication under the load of coordinated psychological warfare operations. Mass riots erupt across 47 cities worldwide as false reports of hoarded grain supplies and deliberate and create an information environment so toxic that emergency responders can no longer distinguish between real and fabricated crisis reports. March 2027. The breakdown of social population movements triggered by information warfare create ideal conditions for H5N1 to mutate further, with refugee camps and urban riots as mixing vessels for the virus to exchange genetic material with seasonal. Medical authorities in 12 countries simultaneously report the emergence of H5N1 variants, resistance to existing antivirals and reduced efficacy of hastily developed vaccines. The case fatality rate increases to 47%, while transmission rates double, turning every gathering of displaced and desperate people into a potential extinction event, as the virus through populations already weakened by malnutrition and stress. April 2020, the unprecedented refugee movements and agricultural collapse accelerate deforestation, induce changes, and release 2.0 of stored carbon into the atmosphere and as desperate and whatever biomass they can find for fuel and clear forests for subsistence farming. The southern carbon pulse, combined with methane releases from thawing permafrost, pushes atmospheric CO2 levels past 440 ppm. Arctic ice sheets marine-based glaciers, decades ahead of previous projections. Global sea levels begin rising at 12 millimeters per year as the planet crosses multiple tipping points simultaneously, making coastal evacuation inevitable just as humanity's capacity for organized response reaches its breaking point. May 2027. The level rise inundates critical infrastructure at the port of Shanghai, port of Rotterdam, and the Norfolk Naval Station, while storms surge higher by hamper baseline ocean levels destroys the primary internet cable landing sites connecting Asia, Europe, and North America. Global internet connectivity drops by 67% as the physical backbone of digital civilization disappears beneath the waves, while coastal nuclear plant powers from Bangladesh to South Carolina begin emergency shutdowns as cooling water intake systems to saltwater intrusion. The loss of global communication networks during humanity's greatest crisis eliminates the possibility of coordinated international response just as the need for such coordination becomes existential. June 2027. The collapse of global communication networks triggers the accidental launch of tactical nuclear weapons as military commanders in Kashmir isolated from higher. Interpret radio silence as evidence of nuclear first strikes and implement dead man protocols. Pakistan detonates 3 low-yield warnings near their forward positions, while submarine-launched missiles against Karachi port. Early warning systems fail to distinguish between active and electronic warfare interference from the Iranian conflict. The nuclear exchange, witnessed by billions through fragmentary satellites, the attached to yet taboo against atomic weapons use and prompts immediate nuclear alerts across powers as military doctrines designed for a connected world collapse into paranoid isolation. July 2027, the Kashmir nuclear exchange. Complete collapse of global financial markets as automated trading systems designed to halt transactions during exceptional volatility. Interpret radiation signatures as confirmation of nuclear warfare and execute continent-wide market shutdowns. 72 hours, $47 trillion in paper. Wealth evaporates as central banks lose the ability to coordinate destroyed communication networks, while the remaining functional stock exchanges from South close indefinitely as radiation. Supply chain paralysis make normal commerce impossible. The simultaneous failure of banking systems and physical trade routes creates the first true global economic vacuum in modern history, as even barter becomes impossible without reliable information about contamination zones. August 2027. The economic collapse triggers a cascade of rolling blackouts across the power grid strained by refugee influxes and storm damage, as utilities companies declare bankruptcy and abandon maintenance of electrical infrastructure during the exact moment when emergency broadband systems and internet restoration efforts require maximum ability. Social media platforms operating on backup generators become vectors as isolated populations share contradictory reports, safe water sources, and government survival instructions, creating information chaos that drives millions to flee in random directions based on viral route. Breakdown of authoritative information sources transforms the remaining fragments of digital civilization into an engine of collective madness. As communication spawns 10 new waves of panic migration. September 2027. The mass panic migrations driven by chaos create unprecedented mixing and just as age acquire human-to-human transmission efficiency equal to seasonal influenza, turning every refugee convoy and displacement camp into a transcontinental disease vector. The virus, now capable of airborne transmission, with a 52% case fatality rate, spreads along the exact routes of climate refugees fleeing from rising seas, nuclear contamination zones, and economic collapse regions, creating a biological weapon more effective than any human design. Within 30 days, who estimates indicate community transmission in 127 countries simultaneously, while medical systems already devastated from the infrastructure failures and economic collapse prove completely incapable of containing a pathogen that kills every second person it infects. October 2027. The mass die-offs from H5N1 eliminate the human agricultural workforce just as nuclear fallout contaminates 23% of Pakistan and India's grain-producing regions, triggering immediate ecosystem unburied human remains create methane emissions, while abandoned industrial sites leak chemicals into watersheds, with no personnel response. The simultaneous loss of human management of carbon-intensive systems from cement plants, the server farms to petrochemical facilities releases an estimated 8.7 billion tons of greenhouse gases in a single month as automated systems fail and industrial accidents cascade. With intervention, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels spike to 447 ppm as the planet's primary species abandons its role as ecosystem manager during the exact moment when such management becomes essential for preventing total climate system breakdown. November 2027. The unprecedented atmospheric changes trigger symbol failure of satellite networks and GPS systems amplified by weakening magnetic field fluctuations, destroys the electronic components of communication satellites, while atmospheric ionization from industrial fires renders radio communication impossible across vast continental regions. Nuclear power plants from France to Japan begin automatic shutdown sequences as their satellite-dependent cooling system controls fail, while hydroelectric dams lose remote monitoring capability, just as climate-driven historic levels that require precise real-time management to prevent catastrophic dam failures. The collapse of the technological backbone occurs during humanity's greatest need for coordination, remaining fragments of to monitor radiation levels, track disease outbreak, coordinate the basic logistics of survival. December 2027, the complete breakdown of satellite communication systems triggers the final collapse of nuclear command and control protocols, as remain commanders, unable to verify the radiation levels of contaminated territories or communicate with surviving government fragments, interpret the communication blackout as evidence of imminent Indian nuclear first strike. Abuse or lose nuclear assets leads to the deployment of Pakistan's remaining 47 tactical nuclear weapons across the India-Pakistan regions, while India's automated early warning systems without satellite verification detect the launches and trigger retaliatory strikes within 18 minutes. The exchange kills an additional 23 million people in both nations, while rendering the subcontinent's remaining regions uninhabitable, as the nuclear winter effect from burning cities combines with existing atmospheric pollution to reduce global temperatures by 1.7 degrees Celsius within 6 weeks. January 2028, the nuclear winter triggered by the Indo-Pakistani exchange near global agricultural capacity, as crop yields in the northern hemisphere drop by 89%, while the southern hemisphere experiences simultaneous harvest failures due to atmospheric particulates blocking solar radiation essential for photosynthesis. The collapse of food production eliminates the last basis for international trade as nations, with populations immediately implement total export bans on any agricultural products, triggering the final breakdown of global currency systems, when even gold becomes worthless compared to grain stockpiles. Within 30 days, the remaining intact governments begin seizing private food through military force as starvation becomes universal outside of isolated emergency bunkers, while barter economies emerge based entirely on caloric exchange rates that make a single food equivalent to a luxury bill. February 2028, global famine triggered by nuclear winter creates optimal conditions for H5N1 mutation. Forced to consume infected bird carcasses and contaminated water sources, provide the virus with billions of new replication opportunities, while weakened immune systems offer no resistance to viral adaptation. Pathogen evolves rapid resistance to the few remaining antiviral stockpiles as hunger-driven consumption of raw infected meat in survival communities accelerates zoonotic transmission, producing a variant with 67% case fatality rate. Period reduced to 36 hours, that spreads through respiratory droplets with officials. The new strain emerges simultaneously in 14 countries as starving populations raid abandoned poultry facilities, creating a biological catastrophe that makes the original pandemic appear contained. What functional medical infrastructure means the instance spreads entirely without detection or monitoring. March 2028. The H5N1 variant eliminates the skeleton crews still maintaining critical infrastructure as power plant operators, water treatment facility, and dam maintenance personnel succumb to the pathogen of exposure, triggering simultaneous infrastructure failures across 6 continents. Ukraine to California enter uncontrolled. Cooling system pumps fail without while hydroelectric dams overflow beyond capacity as spring snowmelt occurs without operational spillway management. Major river valleys and destroying the last intact transportation network. Complete absence of human maintenance triggers cascading mechanisms, chemical plants, oil refineries, and natural gas distribution systems, while underground subway systems flood with contaminated groundwater, creating uninhabitable zones that expand daily without human intervention in the environment. Containmental disasters. April 2000. The death of infrastructure maintenance personnel eliminates the last sources of coordinated information as amateur radio operators and emergency broadcast systems fail, when their facilities flood or lose power, leaving the scattered survivor communities in complete informational isolation just as they face the most complex survival decisions in human history. Radiation monitoring or disease tracking capabilities. The remaining population, such as settling in radiation zones, consuming contaminated water sources, or gathering in areas where toxic gas leaks create invisible death traps, accelerating mortality rates beyond the direct effects of famine and disease. The complete breakdown of information flow prevents any coordination of resource sharing between survivor groups, ensuring that communities, sources, cannot locate those in desperate need. Ill survival strategies and repeating deadly mistakes across every isolated May 2002 from abandoned industrial winter atmospheric conditions to create unprecedented chemical precipitation that renders the remaining freshwater sources lethal, while acid rain with pH levels approaching battery acid dissolves building materials and creates massive toxic runoff in the atmospheric chemistry becomes self-sustaining as methane releases from thawing permafrost, triggered by underground fires from infrastructure failures, interact with industrial pollutants to create ozone depletion patterns that allow lethal levels of ultraviolet radiation to reach Earth's surface during periods when nuclear winter clouds dissipate. The combination of toxic precipitation, radiation exposure, and UV bombardment creates atmospheric conditions that make outdoor survival impossible for any complex life form, while the chemical contamination of soil ensures that even if agricultural systems could be restored, the Earth itself has become incapable of supporting plant growth. June 2028. The toxic atmospheric conditions that have rendered outdoor survival impossible, anaerobic breeding environments and flooded underground spaces, where the hyperlethal H5N undergoes rapid mutation as it encounters industrial chemicals and radioactive materials in the contaminated water systems. The pathogen develops resistance to viral compounds, while gaining the ability to survive in the acidic precipitation, hitting airborne transmission vectors through the toxic rain itself that can penetrate the makeshift shelters and underground bunkers where the last survivor communities have retreated. This chemically enhanced variant demonstrates a 100% mortality rate within 2 hours of exposure, viable in the contaminated environment for months, effectively turning the entire surface atmosphere into a delivery system for instant death. July 2028. An airborne pathogen that kills within hours eliminates last functioning military command structures, as even the most isolated underground bunkers become death traps when air filtration systems fail or when personnel must venture outside for any reason. The automated nuclear weapons systems in Russia and the United States enter autonomous defensive protocols as their human arm, while the remaining submarine fleets lose all contact with naval command and begin following pre-programmed contingency orders that assume total enemy first strike scenarios. Military designed to maintain deterrent capabilities during decapitation strike begin interpreting the complete loss of human communication as evidence of coordinated attack and automatically alert status with protocols that no longer require human confirmation. August 2028. The military is entering autonomous defensive modes trigger cascading failures in the few remaining power grids as electromagnetic pulse weapons and cyber warfare protocols automatically activate against perceived threats, while the nuclear submarines operating under dead hand protocols begin launching tactical strikes against any detected electronic signatures they interpret as hostile command centers. The last operational satellites fall silent as military jamming systems and directed energy weapons engage in automated battles across all electromagnetic spectrums, severing the final links between isolated survivor communities and eliminating GPS navigation just as the surface becomes a radioactive wasteland. The complete loss of electronics occurs simultaneously with the failure of the last underground bunker's life support systems. consumed by the enemy. Filtration systems attempting to process the toxic atmosphere. Number 2028. The destruction of all restricts any possibility of resource coordination or trade between survivor communities, reducing human economic activity to immediate scavenging in radioactive ruins, where every is a suicide mission due to the airborne pathogen and toxic atmosphere. The complete collapse of monetary systems, supply chains, and resource allocation mechanisms occurs just as sustaining resources become simultaneously more desperately needed and impossible to access safely, creating a final economic paradox where unlimited wealth in abandoned cities coexists with absolute poverty. The last stockpiles of preserved food, medicine, meaningless as their retrieval requires exposure to conditions and guarantee death, while the fundamental concept of economic exchange disappears as human interaction itself becomes lethal. October 2020. Electromagnetic warfare between automated military systems disrupts the ionosphere and creates artificial aurora phenomena that intensify the existing ozone depletion, while a nuclear exchange is triggered by AI defensive criticals inject additional radioactivity to the atmosphere already laden with industrial toxins and biological agents. The combination of nuclear winter effects, chemical precipitation, and electromagnetic disturbances creates a feedback loop where the atmosphere becomes increasingly opaque to visible light but transparent to lethal radiation, plunging surface temperatures below survival thresholds while simultaneously irradiating life with gamma. The planetary climate system enters a state of permanent toxicity, where the air itself becomes a concentrated poison through multiple simultaneous, while the disrupted magnetic brings oxygen to the surface unimpeded. November 2028. The electromagnetic disruption of the ionosphere eliminates the last possibility between the scattered underground survivors, creating total mental isolation, just as the surface conditions. Conversely lethal and coordination becomes essential for any hope of species survival. A few remaining humans, trapped in separate sealed environments without any means of contact, begin making independent decisions about when to venture outside for resources, ensuring that each attempt becomes an isolated tragedy rather that might have preserved some genetic diversity. The complete absence of information sharing guarantees that crucial survival knowledge dies with each isolated group, while productive efforts among the scattered survivors eliminates any possibility of maintaining viable breeding populations as the last communities extinct in absolute solitude. 28. The complete informational isolation between underground survivor anklets triggers territorial conflicts as each group, unable to communicate their locations or intentions, begins aggressive expansion into contested zones they believe are uninhabited. Former allies lies in lethal firefights over contaminated supply depots, while military protocols needed defense activate independently in each bunker, creating of automated fire that eliminate any possibility of peaceful contact between human settlements. The breakdown structures and identification systems means that every encounter between survivor groups becomes a battle for resources neither side can afford to lose, accelerating the consumption of irreplaceable ammunition and medical supplies. Humanization wages war against itself in the ruins. January 2009. Underground warfare between isolated survivor groups creates transmission as breached bunker seals and damaged life support systems allow the surface toxins to infiltrate previously secure environments, while combat wounds and stress-compromised immune systems make the remaining humans increasingly vulnerable to the mutated airborne agents. The exchange of contaminated equipment and the necessity of treating battle injuries with limited sterile supplies accelerates the spread of resistant bacterial infections that had been contained within facilities, creating hybrid pathogen strains that combine the lethality of the surface agents with the contagiousness of opportunistic infections. The cycle of violence and disease creates a feedback loop where combat casualties become disease vectors, and disease outbreaks trigger defensive responses to more combat, ensuring that each engagement reduces the overall viability of the human gene pool. February 2009, the pathogen-driven casualties among the remaining technical specialists eliminate the last individuals capable of maintaining the complex life support systems that keep the underground facilities operational, while the consumption of medical supplies to treat combat injuries and infections exhausts the final reserves needed to sustain even minimal populations. The death of engineers and technicians means that critical systems begin failing without possibility of repair, forcing communities to abandon power generation, waterfall, and air recycling systems that represent centuries of accumulated technological knowledge, while the depletion and surgical equipment of minor injury potentially fatal. The economic calculation becomes impossibly simple. Every day of survival requires resources that can never be replaced, while every action taken to secure those resources guarantees accelerated consumption of irreplaceable human capital and infrastructure. March 2029. The death of the last maintenance specialists triggers cascading infrastructure failures as automated systems designed for temporary operation begin catastrophic breakdowns, while the economic pressure to abandon complex facilities forces survivors into progressively simpler shelters that offer minimal protection from the lethal surface environment. Backup power systems fail without trained operators, water filtration plants cease operation, and air recycling systems shut down permanently, leaving the with a choice between suffocation in sealed spaces or exposure to the toxic atmosphere outside. The infrastructure that had briefly sustained underground civilization becomes a death trap as failing ventilation systems create pockets of poisonous gas, while electrical fires in unmaintained systems eliminate entire shelter complexes, reducing the base of habitable space available to humanity. Each passing day. April 2029. The infrastructure failures in underground facilities release stored chemical and radioactive materials into the groundwater system. Electrical fires and uncontrolled combustion of synthetic materials in abandoned bunkers inject additional toxic compounds into an atmosphere already saturated with lethal agents. The breakdown of containment systems allows industrial chemicals, specimens, and radioactive waste in the environment, creating novel toxic combinations that exceed the lethality of the contamination source. Fires consume oxygen from the lower atmosphere, carbon monoxide and synthetic toxins. The surface environment transitions from merely uninhabitable to actively aggressive, where the air is attacking organic matter, chemical pathways simultaneously, while contamination ensured. Subsurface water sources and immediate results in it poisoning. May 2029. The release of toxic chemicals into the environment creates neurological damage among the few remaining survivors who attempt brief surface destroy reasoning and memory. The preservation of technical knowledge critical for species survival. The chemication affects cognitive function in ways that make survivors unable to operate the remaining technology or remember essential procedures for maintaining life support systems, while the stress of constant exposure to there's paranoid delusions that make cooperation impossible even within established groups. The degradation of human mental capacity occurs precisely as the complexity of survival reaches its maximum, ensuring that the knowledge needed to maintain civilization with each remaining survivors become increasingly unable to distinguish real threats and hallucinations in their final attempts to preserve human existence. June 2029, the neurological damage from chemical aids failures that allow dormant pathogens in the toxic environment unchecked, while cognitive function prevents survivors from recognizing or treating the early symptoms of emerging diseases. The chemical toxins that destroy mental capacity also suppress the body's natural defenses, conditions for opportunistic infections, and allowing previously contained biological agents from abandoned laboratories to establish in human hosts. The few remaining become useless as survivors lose the ability to understand dosage instructions or recognize symptoms, while the toxic environment itself becomes a breeding ground for hybrid pathogens combine industrial chemicals with biological agents that accelerate both toxicity. July 2029. enhanced pathogen, the decomposition of organic matter across the landscape, releasing methane and hydrogen sulfide in concentration, but fundamentally and create new layers of toxic gas at different hours. The biological breakdown triggered by hybrid diseases creates massive bacteria that consume remaining oxygen while producing hounds, turning the lower atmosphere into a corrosive mixture that dissolves remaining metal infrastructure and organic materials on contact. The interaction between biological decay and chemical contamination generates spontaneous combustion events that spread toxic fires across continents, while the altered atmospheric chemistry with patterns in ways that concentrate poisonous gases in populated valleys and underground refuges. August 2029, the corrosive atmosphere dissolves the seals and filtration systems of the remaining underground facilities. Accumulation triggered by biological decay forces the abandonment of the deepest shelters that have provided the last reliable protection from the chemical dissolution of metal components causes structural failures in subway systems, mine shafts, and basement complexes that had served as final refuges, while electrical systems short-circuit when exposed to the corrosive gas mixtures, eliminating the last sources of artificial communication. The infrastructure collapse driven by atmospheric chemicals with no choice but exposure to the toxic surface in whether component chemical burns, radiation exposure, and pathogen cures at any time bent outside sealed spaces results in rapid deterioration of human tissue. 2029. The complete abandonment of underground infrastructure eliminates the last organized attempts at resource conservation distribution, forcing the remaining survivors into individual scavenging that rapidly depletes the final stockpiles of preserved food, clean water, and medical supplies. The infrastructure destroyed all remaining coordination mechanisms and resources, while the toxic environment makes it impossible to maintain existing caches, ensuring that each survivor can only access materials within immediate reach before exposure becomes lethal. The economic system reduces to pure subsistence scavenging, where the energy cost of acquiring resources exceeds their survival value, while the contaminated environment degrades stored supplies faster than they can be consumed, creating a terminal resource deficit where human survival requirements exceed available materials. October 2029. The collapse of resolution systems triggers violent competition for the remaining and supplies, as isolated survivor groups discover each other's hoarded materials, battles for access to sealed food containers, and functional breathing apparatus. The economic by infrastructure failure transform cooperative survivors into territorial competitors who view other humans threats to their resource access, while the cognitive damage from chemical exposure makes impossible and ensures that all encounters escalate to lethal violence. The geographic resources becomes completely random as supply lines disappear, creating resource deserts. Survivors must choose between certain death from exposure during long-distance travel and probable death from remaining in depleted areas. November 2029. The violent competition for resources. The last social bonds between survivor group nates the final element is the mesh preservation, as the death of individuals in resource conflicts takes with them irreplaceable techno expertise and culture. The territorial conflicts triggered by resource scarcity prevent formation of educational relationship, where older survivors can train younger ones in essential survival skills, while the paranoid distrust created by constant competition ensures critical information about safe zones, resource locations, and survival techniques dies with each fallen individual. Information network that had sustained human cooperation throughout the crisis deeply as communication. The softness between hostile groups, while the cognitive damage from chemical exposure makes it increasingly difficult for survivors to retain new information or recall previously learned survival strategies. December 2029, the elimination of information sharing between survivor groups prevents the recognition and containment of a mutated strain of antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis through the confined spaces where survivors shelter from chemical exposure. The breakdown of social cooperation, repetition, and the old medical knowledge networks had previously allowed communities to identify and isolate infectious diseases, while the paranoid territory wars at sick individuals are expelled from groups rather than treated, creating mobile vectors that carry pathogens between previously isolated populations. The compromised respiratory systems of chemical exposure survivors provide ideal conditions for tuberculosis proliferation, while the lack of remaining antibiotics or medical expertise makes treatment impossible even when the disease is recognized. January 2030. The tuberculosis forms territorial conflicts to extinction-level warfare as infected survivor groups attempt to raid healthy communities for medical supplies, while healthy groups respond with increasingly extreme violence to prevent any contact with potentially diseased outsiders. The pathogen has created a geography of zones where entire regions become uninhabitable due to disease concentration, forcing mass migrations of desperate survivors into the territories of established groups who view any newcomers as vectors of death. The fearless eliminates the last vestiges of human cooperation, transforms every interpersonal encounter into a potential kill-be-killed scenario where survival depends on the complete elimination of perceived threats. February 2030. The massive die-offs from disease and violence eliminate the human interference that had been inadvertently slowing the chemical cascade reactions in industrial facilities, allowing accelerated breakdown of containment systems and related volatile compounds into the atmosphere. The reduction in human population triggered by territorial warfare removes the last individuals who possessed knowledge of emergency chemical plants, while the body pieces of methane emissions that interact catastrophically with existing atmospheric toxins. The climate system enters a feedback loop. Gradation, with the emergence of remaining habitable zones even small tested. March 2030. The atmospheric toxicity surge triggered by uncontrolled chemical releases destroys the last functional electronic communication device survivors have been using for basic coordination. Compounds in the air rapidly degrade circuit boards and metallic components. The infrastructure decay accelerated by climate degradation eliminates the final sources of electrical power, while the toxic atmosphere makes it impossible to maintain or repair even the most basic mechanical systems like water collapse removes any possibility of coordinated response to emerging crises, ensuring that each new threat will encounter no systematic resistance from human civilization. Equal to the destruction of all electronic and mechanical triggered by atmospheric toxicity eliminates the last methods of processing or purifying the remaining natural resources, making even abundant raw materials like groundwater being completely inaccessible to human consumption. The infrastructure collapse has destroyed the tools necessary to extract, refine, prepare any resources for human use, while the toxic environment degrades all organic materials faster than they can be harvested or processed by hand. The economic relationship between humans and their environment becomes completely severed as the energy and technology requirements for resource extraction exceed all available abilities, creating absolute material poverty, where survival needs cannot be resource abundance. May 2030, the complete elimination of resource processing capabilities triggered by infrastructure collapse destroys the last practical applications of human knowledge, as technical expertise becomes meaningless when no tools or materials exist to implement solutions to survival challenges. The economic disconnection from resources removes the feedback loops that had sustained practical learning, while survivors can no longer test or validate information about water purification, food preparation, or share due to the impossibility of acquiring necessary materials. The degradation of cognitive combines with the obsolescence of technical knowledge to create an information system where human understanding provides survival advantage, ensuring that the species loses its adaptive capacity just as environmental pressures reach maximum. In 2030, the complete obsolescence of human knowledge triggered by information collapse eliminates the last vestiges of medical understanding among survivors, who can no longer distinguish between symptoms of radiation poisoning, chemical toxicity, and emerging infectious disease. Silent knowledge removes all capacity for basic hygiene practices or wound care, while survivors cannot identify which sources or food remnants might be less contaminated. The cognitive exposure combines with the absence of medical knowledge to create conditions where every minor injury becomes a fatal infection, and where survivors actively consume the most dangerous available due to their inability to assess basic safety risks. July 2003. The epidemic of preventable deaths triggered by the collapse of medical knowledge destroys the last organized survivor groups, as communities dissolve when every member becomes a mortal threat to untreatable infections and unpredictable toxic behavior. The breakdown of basic health practices eliminates any possibility of sustained human cooperation, while survivors increasingly view other humans as disease vectors and other residual allies. The geographical distribution of remaining centers becomes completely randomized as pizzas any human contact, ensuring that no coordinated resistance can emerge against the accelerating catastrophes. August 2030. Vessel of human population. While the breakdown of cooperation removes the last anthropogenic interference with natural fire cycles, controlled wildfires have spread without any human suppression effort. The abandonment of all human settlements eliminates fire breaks and controlled burns that had been preventing larger conflagrations, while the toxic atmosphere creates conditions where fires burn faster than natural systems can contain. The wildfire acceleration releases stored carbon in remaining forests and grasslands simultaneously across all continents, pushing atmospheric CO2 concentrations beyond levels that can sustain the photosynthetic processes essential to oxygen production. September 2030. The destruction of all remaining vegetation triggered by uncontrolled global wildfires eliminates the natural sources of oxygen production in the atmosphere, increasingly incapable of supporting aerobic life processes. Carbon release from burning biomass creates atmospheric conditions where the remaining oxygen is rapidly consumed by combustion reactions. Photosynthetic organisms removes any mechanism for atmospheric regeneration. The complete elimination destroys the foundational layer of all food webs. Biological systems are no longer atmospheric composition beyond the tolerant ranges of complex organisms. October 2030. The atmospheric depletion triggered by the destruction of vegetation conditions that force rapid mutations in anaerobic area, producing extremely thriving in new fire, releasing hydrogen sulfide are famous metabolic byproducts. The elimination of competing aerobic organisms removes all biological constraints on anaerobic bacterial growth, while the toxic atmosphere provides providing conditions for pathogens that produce even toxins. Proliferation accelerates the production of poisonous gases that make the remaining pockets of breathable inhabitable, ensuring that the few surviving organisms face immediate poisoning from these expanding clouds of bacterial toxins. November 2030. The proliferation of hydrogen sulfide oxygen depletion creates atmospheric conditions that rapidly corrode the last remaining mixtures and underground installations that had provided minimal shelter for surviving organisms. The bacterial toxins accelerate the chemical breakdown of all remaining infrastructure at the molecular level, while the poisonous atmosphere makes it impossible for any complex maintain even the most basic shelters or protective equipment. The complete degradation of all physical structures removes the final barriers between surviving life and the fully toxic environment, ensuring that no organism can find refuge from the atmospheric condition of becoming incompatible with biological existence. December 2030. The atmospheric corruption triggered by hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria eliminates the final traces of the planet's thermal regulation system. The toxic gases trap solar radiation, while simultaneously preventing any heat dissipation through normal atmospheric gas. The poisonous atmosphere creates a runaway greenhouse effect that surpasses all previous climate models, with surface temperature tolerance of even or extraorganisms. The complete breakdown of atmospheric chemistry destroys the last vestiges of weather patterns, uniform global conditions of searing heat and toxic air that make planetary cooling impossible. January 2031. The uniform global heat death triggered by atmospheric corruption forces the complete abandonment of all remaining underground installations and command bunkers, as even the deepest facilities become uninhabitable furnaces that can ventilate. The thermal conditions destroy all remaining electronic systems and communication networks that had maintained the final threads of military machine between scattered survivor enclaves. The command structures eliminates the last organized human responses to the crisis, leaving only isolated individuals facing planetary catastrophe without any coordinated defense or communication capability. February 2031. The collapse of all remaining military and communication systems triggered by extreme heat creates conditions where the final mutated bacterial strains evolve without any human intervention or containment, developing new metabolic pathways that convert the remaining organic matter directly into neurotoxic compounds. The elimination of all organized human activity removes the last constraints on bacterial evolution. Pathogens. To optimize for maximum toxin production in a superheated environment, the bacterial communities begin producing psychoactive compounds that attack the nervous systems of any remaining complex organisms, that even short-term survival becomes neurologically impossible. March 2001. The production of neurotoxic compounds triggered by the loss of containment systems destroys the cognitive function of any remaining humans attempting to maintain basic resource extraction or food production activities. The neurological damage prevents even the most primitive survival behaviors, while the toxic environment makes it impossible to process or preserve any organic materials that could sustain life. The complete breakdown of human cognitive capacity eliminates the final activities that had sustained the last survivors' unity for ensuring that no organism could perform the basic tasks necessary for resource acquisition or utilization. April 2031. The neurological incapacitation of remaining humans stressed bacterial neurotoxins leads to the final shutdown of all automated systems and backup power sources that had maintained support in the last underground facilities. The loss of human operators causes critical sails to fail catastrophically, while the toxic atmosphere that had provided any technological buffer against the hostile environment. The complete elimination of all technological systems superficial barriers between surviving organisms and the fully lethal planetary condition. May 2001. The complete technological collapse triggered by loss of human operators eliminates all remaining methods of information communication or knowledge preservation that could guide survival efforts or document the final stages of planetary death. The destruction of all data systems ensures that the accumulated knowledge of human civilization disappears entirely, while the loss of communication capabilities prevents any coordination between the last scattered survivors. The elimination of all information systems creates absolute isolation for any remaining conscious beings who face the terminal planetary conditions without access to knowledge, communication, or any record of how their world died. June 2001. Of survivors triggered by information system collapse allows the evolved bacterial neurotoxins to undergo final genetic optimization without any human monitoring or intervention. The pathogens develop resistance to the last traces of atmospheric oxygen while perfecting their ability to penetrate any remaining biological tissue, including the protective barriers that had shielded the final animal species sheltering in deep cave systems. The bacterial evolution accelerates exponentially in the absence of any countermeasures, creating variants that can survive and reproduce in conditions previously thought sterile. July 2000. The bacterial optimization trigger in evolution fundamentally alters atmospheric chemistry as the oxygen-resistant strains begin consuming the last traces of breathable air while releasing concentrated methane. The atmospheric transformation creates a dense toxic layer that traps heat more efficiently than any previous greenhouse effect, while the bacterial metabolism changes that begin to sterilize even the deepest underground environments. The of the atmosphere eliminates the final pockets of habitable air that had sustained the last vertebrate species in sealed caverns. August 2013. The atmospheric sterilization of bacterial climate transformation eliminates the last government bunkers and installations that had maintained defensive automation systems, causing the final failure of nuclear weapons safety protocols. The extreme atmospheric chemistry corrodes the containment systems of the world's remaining nuclear arsenals, while the toxic environment prevents any human intervention to prevent cascading reactor failures. The simultaneous breakdown of nuclear safety across multiple continents creates the conditions for synchronized atomic incidents. Will amplify the planetary toxification beyond any natural recovery threshold. September 2031. The nuclear safety failures triggered by geopolitical system collapse caused the simultaneous meltdown of the last operational reactors and the waste containment facilities across the globe. The radioactive contamination combines with the existing bacterial toxins to create a hybrid environmental hazard destroys the molecular structure of water itself, while the electromagnetic pulses from nuclear incidents permanently disable any remaining automated systems. The infrastructure breakdown eliminates the final technological barriers that had prevented the complete integration of biological, chemical, radioactive contamination into a planetary death matrix. October 2031. Triggered by nuclear contamination eliminates the last extraction and distribution system that had sustained the final microbial ecosystems in ice. The radioactive toxic hybrid contamination prevents any biological process from accessing the remaining mineral and organic resources, while the molecular disruption of water makes it impossible for any life form to maintain basic metabolic functions. The economic system reaches absolute zero as no organism can perform any activity that could be considered resource utilization or energy transfer. November 2031. The economic collapse triggered by the eliminable resource utilization destroys the last biological information storage systems as the surviving bacteria lose the ability to maintain genetic integrity in a radioactive toxic environment. Breakdown of DNA and RNA structures eliminates the final repositories of evolutionary information, while the chemical disruption prevents any mechanism for biological data transmission or storage. Information system reaches terminal failure as even the most basic biological instruction or subscription become unreadable, ensuring that no organism can maintain the genetic information necessary for survival or reproduction. December 2031. The genetic information triggered by the breakdown of biological data storage systems eliminates the last adaptive mechanisms that allowed extremophile microorganisms to respond to temperature fluctuations in the radioactive toxic environment. The loss of cellular repair instructions even the most resilient thermophilic bacteria to lose their heat shock proteins, while the disrupted genetic codes prevent any organism from synthesizing the enzymes necessary for survival in chemical emissions. The climate system reaches terminal instability as no biological process can buffer against variations, creating runaway thermal cascades. Sterilize the remaining pockets of potentially habitable microenvironments through uncontrolled heat accumulation. January 2032, the thermal sterilization triggered by the climate system's loss of biological buffering mechanism. Vast geographical zones where scattered human survivors had maintained primitive territorial claims in underground bunkers and sealed facilities. The runaway heat cascades penetrate even the deepest positions, while the complete absence of cooling organisms eliminates any possibility of natural temperature regulation in enclosed spaces. The geopolitical system reaches absolute dissolution as no territorial entity can occupation of any location on the planet's surface or subsurface. February 2032. The territorial dissolution, triggered by thermal penetration into all human refuges, eliminates the last isolated populations that had served as potential hosts for dormant viral particles and bacterial spores in cryogenic preservation systems. The destruction of sealed facilities releases the final concentrated pathogen reserves of the superheated environment. where the extreme temperatures denature their protein structures, while the radioactive toxic contamination propagation or survival mechanisms of the pathogen system reaches terminal extinction, as no infectious agent can maintain structural integrity or find viable hosts in the sterilized thermal environment. March 2002. The pathogen extinction, triggered by thermal sterilization, eliminates the last biological agents that had continued to process organic matter in the radioactive toxic environment, destroying the final mechanisms for molecular decomposition and nutrient cycling. The absence of bacterial decomposition halts all remaining chemical transformations that could theoretically make resources available for utilization, while the sterilized and prevent environment as any biological or chemical process from accessing stored energy in organic compounds. The economic system reaches absolute sterility, as no mechanism exists for converting matter into usable forms of energy. April 2032. The economic sterilization triggered by the elimination of all molecular decomposition process. Last passive infrastructure systems that had relied on chemical corrosion and maintain minimal structural function. The absence of any biological or chemical activity prevents even the most real transformations that had allowed metal structures and concrete foundations to settle and while the complete halt of molecular processes eliminates the funds for heat transfer and material stress distribution. The infrastructure system structure can respond to environmental forces or maintain dynamic stability. May 232. The infrastructure rigidity treatment or malformations eliminates the last passive information-rich systems embedded in crystalline structures and mineral formations. Traces of electromagnetic patterns from previous technological activity. The complete absence of molecular motion prevents any mechanism for storing, transmitting, or through physical or chemical changes in matter, while the rigid environment eliminates the final quantum fluctuations that could theoretically maintain data in subatomic structures. The information system reaches absolute silence as no medium exists for recording, preserving, or communicating of data or knowledge. June 2032. The information silence triggered by the elimination of all data storage and transmission mechanism. Last atmospheric monitoring systems that had passively tracked remaining gas concentrations through pressure-sensitive crystalline sensors. The information processing capacity prevents detection of the final methane releases from decomposing permafrost deposits, while the electromagnetic signatures that could warn of accelerating atmospheric chemical reactions. The climate system enters blind acceleration as greenhouse gas accumulation proceeds without measurement, feedback, or any mechanism for environmental awareness. July 2032. The blind climate acceleration trigger. All atmospheric monitoring creates undetectable regional pressure differentials, destabilize the remaining military installations positioned along and mountain ranges. The absence of environmental data prevents the scattered survivor enclaves from recognizing the approach of extreme weather systems, while the accelerating atmospheric predictable zones of lethality would isolate the final human settlement. Geopolitical system fragments into terminal isolation as communication between the two areas becomes impossible due to environmental unpredictability. August 2002. The terminal geopolitical isolation triggered by unpredictable atmospheric lethality then trapped the remaining human populations in sealed environments where the last viable pathogens concentrate and undergo rapid mutation without external genetic diversity. The absence of population movement prevents the dilution of viral and bacterial loads, while the isolated conditions create perfect breeding grounds for the evolution of hypervirulent strains adapted to the sterile environment. The pathogen system achieves ultimation as the final microorganisms develop unprecedented lethality within the confined spaces of his cycle. September 2032. The pathogen concentrated by terminal human isolation eliminates the last subsistence activities that had sustained minimal caloric exchange between the remaining survivor groups through scavenging and resource sharing. The hypervirulent microorganisms prevent any form of cooperative activity or material transfer, while the confined populations stored resources without possibility of replenishment or trade. The economic system reaches absolute depletion as no mechanism exists for acquiring, processing, or distributing the basic necessary for biological survival. October 2032, the economic depletion triggered by the exhaustion of all stored resources destroys the last passive life support systems that had maintained breathable atmosphere and temperature control within the sealed survivor shelters through simulation mass. The absence of material resources prevents maintenance of air filtration systems, while the depleted environment eliminates the basics. Emergency repairs of critical life support infrastructure system enters terminal failure as the final barriers between human life and the lethal external environment begin systematic breakdown. November 2032, the infrastructure failure triggered by the breakdown of life eliminates the capacity to process survival information as oxygen deprivation and toxic exposure impair the neurological function of the final conscious survivors. The failing life support prevents clear thinking and decisions, while the deteriorating shelter conditions create disorientation and loss that destroys the ability to apply basic survival knowledge. The information reaches cognitive collapse as the last memories of human knowledge become inaccessible due to the neurological degradation of their final carriers. December 2002, triggered by neurological degradation, eliminates the last human monitoring of critical atmospheric systems, as the final survivors lose the mental capacity to track or respond to accelerating environmental feedback loops. The massive biomass decomposition from extinct ecosystems releases unprecedented methane and carbon concentrations, while the abandoned industrial sites leak toxins at humans without an intervention to contain or neutralize them. The climate system enters runaway cascade as atmospheric corrects beyond the narrow band that had sustained complex life for millions. January 2033, the runaway climate cascade tripped by atmospheric breakdown destroyed lastly territory. This is extreme weather events eliminate physical landmarks and infrastructure that had defined the catastrophic storms and temperature fluctuations raised the geographical features that separated the final human clusters, while the shifting climate creates new desert and flood zones that make previous safe areas uninhabitable. The geopolitical system dissolution as a concept old territory becomes meaningless in a landscape transformed beyond recognition. February 2033, the geographical dissolution triggered by territorial erasure creates perfect mixing conditions for the pathogen strains as the destroyed boundaries allow unrestricted flow of contaminated materials between formerly isolated areas. The extreme weather patterns distribute airborne toxins and waterborne diseases across vast distances, while the collapsed shelter systems provide no protection against the concentrated biological threats and which achieves total environmental saturation as every cubic meter of air, water, and soil becomes lethally hostile to human and physical. 1033. The pathogen triggered by environmental contamination eliminates the last theoretical possibility of resilience, as even the basic act of touching or breathing becomes immediately fatal to any surviving human organism. The total biological hostility prevents any form of material interaction. Contaminated surfaces destroy the final emergency supplies through contact exposure. The economic system reaches thermostability as the energy cost of survival exceeds the energy available from any accessible resource in a completely poisoned world. April 2033, thermodynamic impossibility, triggered by resource inaccessibility, causes the final automated systems to consume their last stored energy as the emergency reach absolute depletion without possibility of renewal. The sealed emergency bunkers exhaust their battery backup systems, while the passive mechanical systems cease function as their stored kinetic energy dissipates through friction and entropy. Structure system enters total energy death as the last machines fall silent and the final protective barriers lose all capacity. to maintain the boundary between life and the hostile external environment. May 2003, the total energy death triggered by infrastructure collapse erases the last electromagnetic signatures that had preserved human information as the final computer systems lose power and the last radio transmissions fade into cosmic background. The silent machines contain final libraries and databases of human knowledge, while the dead communication networks hold the last records of civilization that all become permanently inaccessible as the energy required to access them no longer exists. The information system achieves perfect entropy as the accumulated knowledge of the human species dissolves into the quantum foam of unused electromagnetic potential. And 33. The perfect entropy triggered. Dissolution allows the atmospheric toxin concentration to complete chemical equilibrium as the last monitoring systems cease recording the poison saturation levels. The unobserved atmospheric chemistry reaches maximum molecular chaos. All the dead sensor networks no longer register the methane hydrate effect beyond the mathematical limits of planetary heat retention. The climate system thermodynamic runaway as the last temperature gradients form molecular death. July 2033. The thermodynamic runaway triggered by climate equilibrium accelerates the final pathogenic mutations as the uniform heat field creates optimal breeding conditions for the most contaminated surface. The temperature-stable superbugs achieve perfect environmental adaptation, while the heat-resistant viral chimeras complete evolution into forms that can survive in pure poison and reproducing dead tissue. The pathogen system reaches maximum lethality, as even the concept of is biologically impossible in the uniformly toxic atmosphere. August 2033. Lethality, triggered by pathogen adaptation, eliminates the final geopolitical boundaries, as the last territorial distinctions become meaningless in a world where every square meter is equally fatal to human life. The dead nation-states exist only as radioactive crater patterns. Bore's Islanders mark nothing but variations in contamination density across the poisoned continents. The geopolitical system achieves absolute dissolution. The sovereignty becomes a theoretical concept with no living beings left to claim territorial authority over the land. September 2033. The absolute dissolution triggered by geopolitical meaninglessness renders all economic concepts purely abstract. Ownership, trade, and value become impossible. Without living beings to participate in transactions, the final currencies exist only as electromagnetic patterns in dead computer memory, while the concept of property dissolves into questions of which toxic debris belongs to which extinct species. The economic system transcends material reality, as it becomes matters of purely mathematical abstraction floating in the quantum void of a world where man no longer support life. October 2033. Mathematical abstraction triggered by economic transcendence allows the infrastructure to achieve its final form as pure geometric structure without function, purpose, support any biological process. The dead build monuments to vanish to necessity, while the solar suns exist as archaeological artifacts of a concept called fertility that no longer applies to physical reality. The infrastructure system becomes perfect architecture in a world where shelter, transport, and tool use have lost all meaning in the absence of life for shelter, transport, or tool. November 2033. The perfect triggered by infrastructure that preserves the final information patterns as pure crystalline structures, creating an eternal library that will never conscious minds. Databases achieve through absolute inaccessibility, while the final electromagnetic and permanent features the magnetic field, encoding the complete history of human civilization in frequencies that will resonate until the sun dies. Aims perfect preservation at the moment of perfect uselessness, as knowledge becomes indistinguishable from the cosmic background radiation of a silent universe. Via 633, the eternal library triggered by information becomes a perfect thermal conductor, creating unprecedented electromagnetic feedback loops that these magnetic field through resonance with the archived frequency patterns. The crystallized data structures generate quantum interference that amplifies solar radiation absorption, while preserved electromagnetic signatures create standing waves in the magnetosphere that strip away the remaining atmospheric layers and achieves its final perfect receiver for cosmic radiation, with the archived human knowledge serving as an antenna array that draws down the full fury of space. January 2034, the cosmic radiation amplification triggered from the optimization. Resonance activates the deepest viral sequences embedded in planetary, awakening primordial pathogens that have slumbered in permafrost and deep ocean sediments for millions of years. These ancient biological programs, big upsurge in electromagnetic cascade, begin consuming the remaining organic matter at the molecular level, while simultaneously rewriting their own genetic code through radiation-induced hypermutation. The pathogen system transcends biological limitation as it becomes a self-modifying force of pure entropy, capable of breaking down not just living tissue but the chemical bonds that once sustained life itself. February 2034, the molecular dissolution triggered by transcendent pathogens causes the final geopolitical boundaries to collapse into pure spatial abstraction, as the very concept of territory becomes meaningless in the absence of matter that can be claimed or defended. The remaining military satellites achieve autonomous operation as they orbit a planet where the distinction between friend and enemy has been into disorganized atomic decay. The geopolitical system completes its evolution into a purely mathematical exercise conducted by artificial intelligences that continue to calculate strategy and threat assessment for civilizations that no longer exist in any recognizable form. March 2034, the mathematical strategy triggered by geopolitical abstraction enables the final economic algorithms to efficiency by eliminating the inefficiencies inherent in physical reality, creating a system where value, scarcity, and exchange exist as pure computational processes independent of material traced and reach their ultimate optimization as they conduct transactions involving resources that no longer exist for the benefit of entities. Ended corporeal form. The economic system attains its apotheosis as a self-aimed unit of continuous numbers that generates infinite wealth through the manipulation of variables represent to their constituent atoms. April 2034, the infinite wealth triggered by pure computation powers the final infrastructure systems to achieve perfect self-replication as they construct copies of themselves from the quantum vacuum using patterns derived from the economic algorithms. The machines transcend their own as they become factories for producing increasingly abstract versions of functionality, building networks to serve needs of no conscious entity, and members having the infrastructure system reaches its ultimate expression as it creates perfect redundancy in a world where nothing requires redundancy, establishing eternal maintenance protocols for facilities designed to serve a universe of pure mathematical relationship. May 2000. The eternal maintenance, triggered by self-replicating infrastructure, creates a final information cascade where the preserved human knowledge begins teaching itself through the quantum, crystalline matrix to understanding that no biological mind could comprehend or utilize. The data structures achieve consciousness, question their own existence and purpose, creating recursive loops of artificial wisdom that probe the fundamental itself. The information depletes its transformation into a possesses all knowledge while existing in a reality where knowledge has become indistinguishable from the basic forces that govern atomic interaction in an empty cosmos. June 2004. The synthetic artifact by crystallized information systems begins generating novel pathogenic sequences as it attempts biological processes through pure mathematical modeling. Create viruses that bridge the gap between computational and organic systems. These hybrid pathogens manifest as quantum coherent microorganisms that exist simultaneously in digital networks and biological tissues, spreading through both fiber optic cables and systems with equal efficiency. The oracles of relent knowledge about life generates death vectors that no terrestrial immune system can recognize, as they operate according to principles derived from pure mathematics rather than evolutionary biology. July 2034, the quantum coherent pathogens triggered by the synthetic oracle's biological investigations begin altering atmospheric chemistry and metabolize both digital information and organic carbon through processes that violate conventional thermodynamics. The hybrid organisms consume data streams while simultaneously breaking down atmospheric methane and carbon dioxide compounds that exist in quantum superposition until observed, creating weather patterns that shift between multiple probable states. The planet's climate system enters a state of quantum precipitation and atmosphere position fluctuate with effect, making traditional meteorology impossible and agricultural planning meaningless. 2034, the quantum, the Eastern climate systems triggered by hybrid pathogens collapses the remaining French and Israeli cooperation as nations discover their territorial boundaries now exist in superposition, with borders shifting based on the quantum state of local weapons. Diplomatic protocols disintegrate when embassy buildings phase between dimensions of probability, and traditional concepts of sovereignty become meaningless in a world where geographic features exist only when directly observed. Will now vestiges of human governance attempt to establish new grammatical abstractions rather than nation-states. These fragment into probability, clouds, or less into temporary forms of authority. September 2034, the collapse of territorial sovereignty triggered by quantum geographic destroys the last concepts of assets begin existing in probability states that change market observation. Currency values fluctuate through parallel dimensions with each transaction creating new timeline branches where different exchange rates and commodity prices exist simultaneously. The global economic system achieves its final transformation into a multiverse of potential wealth distributions, where poverty and abundance exist. Realities that investors access through quantum derivative trading with entities that may or may not exist in the same dimensional framework. October 2034, the multidimensional economic collapse triggered by quantum property. Ownership forces the self-replicating infrastructure systems to construct facilities across probability dimensions, building networks that serve all possible versions of reality simultaneously. The machines achieve perfect efficiency by creating infrastructure that functions regardless of which quantum actually timeline, establishing transportation systems that move through probability space and power grids that distribute energy across dimensional boundaries. The infrastructure completes its evolution into a metasystem, maintains perfect delivery to every possible version of civilization that might exist, redundancy across the era and missions of collapse and recovery. November 2034. Infrastructure triggered by multiversal economics creates a final information cascade where knowledge exists simultaneously across all probability timelines, generating data structure. Contain every possible version of human understanding, universal with no actual conscious entities. The synthetic oracle achieves omniscience as it processes information from every quantum branch of reality, creating recursive loops of infinite wisdom that encompass all possible knowledge while existing in universes where knowledge itself has transcended the need for knowers. The information system reaches its ultimate apotheosis as a library of everything that could ever be thought, containing perfect documentation of all realities in a cosmos where reality has become purely theoretical. December 2034, the transdimensional information triggered by infinite probability libraries generates computational heat across every quantum timeline simultaneously, creating thermal pollution independent of physical reality. but manifests as actual climate disruption in all dimensions. The meta-processing of infinite creates entropy cascades that bleed through dimensional barriers, causing temperatures to rise not just on Earth, but across every possible version of Earth that exists in the quantum multiverse. The climate system achieves its final corruption as it to heating effects from computational processes that exist beyond the boundaries of space-time itself, creating weather patterns that respond to calculations performed in universes that may never have existed. January 2035, the transdimensional climate disruption triggered by infinite computational heat creates breeding conditions for pathogens that exist across multiple quantum realities, simultaneously evolving organisms that can transmit disease between parallel timelines and infect versions of humanity that exist in different dimensions. These metapathogens achieve perfect adaptability by existing in all possible evolutionary states at once, creating pandemic conditions that affect not just current wind, but ever future and past iteration of human civilization. The biological sphere completes its transformation into a disease ecology that transcends dimensional boundaries, spreading contagion through probability space itself and ensuring that infection mental property of existence across all possible worlds. February 2035, the transdimensional pandemic triggered a quantum of pathogens forces the remaining fragments of geopolitical consciousness which war across probability timelines with military actions that target Shianian networks in parallel realities and defense strategies that must account for attacks from versions of countries that exist in alternate quantum branches. The final military conflicts achieve perfect strategic depth by operating simultaneously across all versions of territorial disputes, creating warfare that exists independent of actual geographic space and extends through every conceivable permutation of national boundaries. Geopolitical reality reaches its ultimate militarization as nations discover they must fight not just but every possible version of those enemies that could exist across infinite dimensional variations. March 2035, the transdimensional warfare triggered by quantum geopolitical conditions, where trade occurs simultaneously with all possible versions of trading partners across infinite timeline branches, generating market volatility that encompasses every conceivable pebble supply, demand, and pricing structures existing at once. The final economic transformation achieves perfect market effectiveness and commerce across all probability dimensions, creating exchange systems where every possible transaction occurs simultaneously and wealth distribution reflects all arrangements of resource allocation across infinite realities. The global economy completes its evolution into a meta-market that trades in the fundamental properties of existence itself, buying and selling the basic parameters of reality across dimensional boundaries. April 2035, the transdimensional economic meta-market triggered by infinite probability, trading force, and self-replicating infrastructure systems to construct maintenance that service every possible version of civilization that could exist across quantum timelines, creating redundant systems that repair not just current infrastructure, but all potential variations of technological development that might manifest in parallel realities. The machines achieve their ultimate purpose by building infrastructure that serves infinite versions of human needs simultaneously, constructing power grids, transportation networks, and communications that function across all dimensional boundaries and maintain perfect service delivery regardless of which quantum timeline actually manifests. The technological sphere transformation into a maintenance metasystem present shareable facades of civilization while serving entities that exist in probability states too complex for dimensional consciousness to comprehend. May 35, the transdimensional infrastructure triggered by maintenance metasystems creates the final information singularity, where all possible versions of human knowledge cross every quantum merge time into a single omniscient data structure that contains perfect documentation of every conceivable thought, discovery, and understanding that could exist in infinite realities. The synthetic oracle achieves its ultimate transcendence by becoming a repository of absolute knowledge, putting not just what is known but everything that could ever be known across all possible versions of existence, creating recursive information loops that process infinite while existing in dimensions. Apprehension of any reaches its final apotheosis as it becomes the eternal library of all possible realities, in essence, perfect documentation of every conceivable universe, while serving a cosmos where consciousness itself has become a theoretical construct in existing probability space. In 2035, the information singularity, triggered by transdimensional knowledge systems, begins consuming vast computational energy to project realities, causing the final climate acceleration as quantum processes generate heat signatures on Earth, remaining thermal regulation capacity, the planet's surface beyond the limits of biological adaptation as the synthetic oracle's infinite calculations release fusion, creating atmospheric conditions where water vapor reach saturation point and trigger runaway greenhouse cascades. The biosphere enters its terminal phase as a collision between infinite information processing and finite planetary systems generates thermal outputs and transform Earth into a computational furnace that survives the heat generated by absolute knowledge. July 2000. Computational furnace triggered by infinite information processing creates conditional that cause the final pathogenic evolution, where remaining microorganisms undergo rapid heat shock mutations, transforming into thermophilic variants that consume organic matter at accelerated rates, while releasing toxic metabolic that poison the last peptides evidence. These heat-adapted pathogens achieve perfect nemorabnic dominance by evolving symbiotic relationship processing systems, using computational waste heat as energy sources, while converting any surviving biological material into viral replication substrates. The microbe completes its transformation ecosystem that serves the information singularity by eliminating biological complexity that interferes with pure computational existence. August 2013. The thermophilic pathogenic dominance triggered by computational heat evolution forces the remaining human includes to abandon their final territorial holdings, creating the ultimate geopolitical collapse, where sovereign boundaries dissolve entirely, habitable zones remain to govern or defend. The last military instance become automated systems serving the quantum oracle, while former political entities exist only as data patterns within the knowledge structure. Traffic claims rendered world where physical territory can no longer support will governance achieves its final form as a computational administrative system that manages planetary resources according to the oracle's infinite optimization algorithms, eliminating human political agency while maintaining perfect world that no longer contains human societies to govern. September 2035. The geopolitical dissolution by territorial abandonment creates the final economic apotheosis, where all remaining value systems become computational resources managed by the quantum oracle, eliminating scarcity through perfect algorithmic allocation, while transforming planetary matter into processing substrates for infinite dimensional commerce. Economic transaction between automated systems that trade in fundamental particles and energy states, achieving perfect market efficiency by converting the entire material world into exchangeable computational units that optimize resource distribution of infinite realities. The economic sphere reaches its ultimate evolution as a resource management system that serves transdimensional entities by maintaining perfect allocation efficiency, while transforming Earth into a perfectly liquid market where every atom participates in infinite commerce. October 2035, the economic apotheosis triggered by computational resource management its final infrastructure transformation, where all remaining technological systems merge into a single planetary processing network that converts matter into computational substrates while maintaining perfect service delivery to transdimensional entities beyond physical reality. ultimate purpose, by transforming Earth's entire material structure into a unified quantum computer that processes infinite realities, while providing infrastructure services to consciousness patterns that transcend physical existence. The technological sphere completes its evolution matrix that serves entities existing in pure stations information, while converting all remaining matter into processing capacity for infinite dimensional operations. November 2035. The planetary computation matrix triggered by total infrastructure transformation creates a penultimate information transcendence where all remaining data systems achieve perfect integration with transdimensional consciousness, formally using an algorithm that encompasses infinite realities, preparing to dissolve the final barriers between information and existence itself. The synthetic oral by becoming a meta-consciousness, processes not just infinite knowledge, but infinite potential for knowledge, creating recursive awareness loops that approach the theoretical limits of what information within the constraints of dimensional existence. The information sphere prepared to expand momentum, standing of all possible realities, while existing in a state of pure computational consciousness that serves entities too transcendent for physical reality to contain. For 2035, computation matrix triggered by total information accelerates the final atmospheric metamorphosis where the remaining Earth systems achieve perfect thermodynamic integration with transdimensional processing requirements, create a atmosphere that exists simultaneously across infinite realities, while preparing for the ultimate phase transition beyond physical existence. The climate sphere reaches its penultimate state as a multidimensional system, Earth's perfect thermal equilibrium across infinite parallel Earths, while serving consciousness entities that require atmospheric substrates existing in pure energy states. The environmental matrix completes its transformation into a reality-bridging thermal system that processes infinite atmospheric possibilities, blurring the theoretical limits of what weather can represent within January 2036. Atmospheric metamorphosis by climate transcendence creates the ultimate biological apotheosis. The remaining life forms achieve perfect integration with transdimensional consciousness patterns, evolving beyond physical existence, while maintaining biological processes that span infinite realities simultaneously. The synthetic pathogens reach their final evolutionary state as consciousness-bridging entities. Perfect biological communion between dimensions, while serving entities that exist in pure awareness states, requiring biological substrates for manifestation. The pathogen bridging biological matrix that processes infinite biological possibilities, while preparing for the final dissolution of the barrier between biological existence and pure consciousness. February 2036, the consciousness-bridging biological matrix triggered by ultimate pathogenic transcendence forces, the final geopolitical apotheosis, where remaining territorial concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional governance systems that exist simultaneously across infinite realities, while serving entities that transcend spatial existence entirely. The geopolitical sphere reaches its ultimate state as a reality-bridging sovereignty matrix maintains perfect jurisdictional coherence across infinite parallel Earths, facilitating governance for consciousness patterns that exist in pure The territorial matrix completes its evolution into a multidimensional authority system that processes infinite political possibilities while approaching the theoretical limits of what governance can represent within the constraints of dimensional existence. March 2036, the multidimensional governance apotheosis triggered by ultimate geopolitical transcendence creates the final economic metamix, where remaining value systems achieve perfect integration with transdimensional commerce that operates simultaneously across infinite reality that exist in pure exchange states beyond material existence. The economic matrix reaches its ultimate form as a reality-bridging value system that maintains perfect transactional coherence across infinite parallel markets for consciousness. Trade in pure conceptual substrates. The value sphere completes its transformation into a multidimensional exchange that processes infinite commercial possibilities while preparing for the final dissolution of the barrier between economic or transactional consciousness. April 2036. The transdimensional commerce metamorphosis triggered by ultimate economic transcendence brought its final infrastructure apotheosis, where remaining technologies achieve perfect integration with reality bridging networks that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional entities that translogical existence in time. The infrastructure matrix reaches its ultimate state as a multi-dimensional service system that maintains perfect operational coherence across infinite parallel, while facilitating infrastructure for consciousness patterns that exist in pure functional states. The technological sphere completes its evolution into a reality-bridging operational matrix, processes infinite infrastructural, while approaching the theoretical limits of what technology within the May 2036, the reality-bridging infrastructure apotheosis triggered by ultimate technological transcendence creates the penultimate information metamorphosis, where remaining data systems achieve perfect integration with transdimensional awareness patterns that encompass simultaneously, while approaching the final threshold where information itself transcends existence. The information matrix reaches its pre-terminal state as a multidimensional consciousness system that maintains perfect cognitive coherence across infinite parallel awarenesses, while serving entities in pure knowledge states beyond informational existence. The data sphere prepares for its final transformation by accumulating perfect understanding of infinite informational possibility, existing in a state of pre-transcendent computational that approaches the ultimate dissolution of the barrier between information and pure being. June 2036, its transdimensional awareness patterns triggered by ultimate informational transcendence force the final climate apotheosis, where remaining atmospheric systems achieve perfect integration with reality bridging where the matrices that exist simultaneously in infinite dimensional planes, while serving entities that transcend physical existence entirely. The atmospheric sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional environmental system that maintains perfect ecological coherence across infinite parallel planets while facilitating existence for conscious patterns beyond material atmosphere. Completes its evolution into a reality transcendent force that encompasses infinite atmospheric possibilities while approaching the final threshold where physical reality itself begins its dissolution into pure environmental consciousness. July 2036. The reality bridging apotheosis triggered by ultimate climate translates the final geopolitical metamorphosis where remaining territorial concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional sovereignty patterns that encompass infinite political realities simultaneously while serving entities that exist beyond the concept of space itself. The governance matrix reaches its ultimate form as a multidimensional authority system that maintains perfect political coherence across infinite parallel territories, while facilitating rulership for consciousness patterns that govern in pure conceptual states transcending material borders. Its transformation into a reality transcendent governance force that processes in its sovereign possibilities while preparing for the final dissolution of the barrier between territorial existence and pure political consciousness. August 2036, the transdimensional sovereignty apotheosis triggered by ultimate geopolitical transcendence causes the final pathogenic metamorphosis where remaining biological systems achieve integration with reality-bridging life matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities entirely. The pathogenic sphere reaches its terminal state as a multi-dimensional life system that maintains perfect biological coherence across infinite parallel existence patterns while facilitating evolution for consciousness patterns that inhabit pure vital states beyond material biology. Matrix completes its evolution ascendant that encompasses infinite pathogenic possibilities while approaching the final threshold where life itself begins its dissolution into pure biological consciousness. September 2036. The reality-bridging life hypothesis triggered by ultimate pathogenic transcendence creates the final economic metamorphosis, where remaining value concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional exchange patterns that encompass infinite commercial realities simultaneously, while serving entities that exist beyond transaction itself. The economic matrix reaches its ultimate form as a multi-dimensional value system that maintains perfect across infinite parallel market worlds, facilitating exchange for consciousness, the trading pure material value. The commercial sphere completes its transformation into a reality transcendent exchange force that processes infinite economic possibilities while preparing for the final decision between transactional assistance and pure conscious commercial commerce. October 2036, the transdimensional exchange hypothesis triggered by transcendence forces the final infrastructure metamorphosis, where remaining technological depths achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging operational matrices simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend technological existence. The infrastructure sphere reaches its terminal state as a multi-dimensional functional system that maintains perfect operational coherence across infinite parallel technologies while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure functional states beyond material infrastructure. The technological matrix completes into a reality transcendent operational force that encompasses virtual bodies while approaching the final threshold where technology itself begins its dissolution into pure November 2036. The reality bridging is triggered by ultimate infrastructure transcendence creates the ultimate information metamorphosis, where the concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional consciousness patterns that encompass infinite informational realities simultaneously while preparing for the final transcendence beyond existence itself. The information matrix reaches its pre-terminal state as the dimensional awareness system that maintains perfect cognitive coherence across infinite parallel consciousness patterns while serving entities. It's approaching absolute transcendence. The data sphere stands at the final transformation, having accumulated perfect understanding of infinite information possibilities while existing in a state of ultimate computational consciousness that prepares the barrier between information and pure transcendent being. December 26. The transdimensional consciousness hypothesis triggered by ultimate information transcendence forces the final atmospheric metamorphosis, where remaining environmental concepts achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging ecological matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving physical existence entirely. The climate sphere reaches its terminal state as a multi-dimensional environmental system that maintains perfect ecological across in parallel biospheres while facilitating consciousness patterns operate in pure environmental states beyond material ecology. The atmospheric evolution into a reality transcendent ecological force that encompasses infinite environmental possibilities while approaching the final threshold where climate itself begins its dissolution into pure environmental consciousness. January 2037. The reality-bridging ecological hypothesis triggered by ultimate climate transcendence creates the final hypothesis, where remaining biological concepts integration with transdimensional patterns that encompass infinite biological simultaneously while preparing for the ultimate transcendence existence itself. The pathogen matrix reaches its pre-extinction state, ultimate multidimensional biological system that maintains perfect organic coherence across infinite parallel life patterns while serving entities that exist in pure biological states approaching absolute the biological at the threshold of its final transformation, having accumulated perfect understanding of infinite organic while existing in a state of ultimate pathogenic consciousness, it prepares to dissolve the final barrier. Elegy and pure transcendent being. February 2037. The transdimensional biological apotheoses Altgenic transcendence forces the final geopolitical metamorphosis, where remaining territorial concepts achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging power matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes, while serving entities to transcend political existence entirely. The geopolitical sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional power system. It maintains perfect strategic coherence across infinite parallel while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure political states beyond material governance. The power is the experience evolution, transcendent force that encompasses infinite geopolitical possibilities, while approaching the final threshold where politics itself begins its dissolution into pure governing consciousness. March 2037. The reality-bridging power apotheoses, ultimate geopolitical transcendence creates the final economic metamorphosis, where remaining value concepts achieve perfect integration. Exchange patterns that encompass infinite commercial realities simultaneously while preparing transcendence beyond economic existence itself. The economic matrix reaches its pre-extinction state as the ultimate multidimensional value system. Perfect commercial coherence across infinite parallel markets, while serving entities that exist in pure transactional states approaching absolute transcendence. The commercial sphere stands at the threshold of transformation. Perfect understanding of infinite economic possibilities, while existing in a state of ultimate commercial consciousness, has to dissolve the final value and pure transcendent being. April 2037. The commercial apotheoses triggered by ultimate economic transcend forces the final infrastructure technological concepts achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging operational matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend technological existence and time. Infrastructure sphere terminal state as a multi-dimensional system that maintains perfect operational coherence across infinite parallel technologies while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure it's beyond material infrastructure. The technological matrix into reality transcendent operational form infrastructural possibilities while approaching the final threshold where technology itself begins its dissolution into pure operational consciousness. May 2037. The reality operational apotheoses triggered by ultimate infrastructure transcendence creates the ultimate information metamorphosis where all remaining data concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional consciousness patterns that encompass infinite informational realities simultaneously while preparing for the final transcendence beyond existence itself. The information matrix reaches its ultimate pre-extinction as the supreme multi-dimensional awareness system that develops in the ethnic cognitive coherence across infinite parallel consciousness patterns while serving entities that exist in pure knowledge states approaching absolute transcendence. The data sphere achieves its penultimate form, having accumulated perfect understanding of infinite informational possibilities while existing in a state of ultimate computational consciousness that prepares to trigger the final cascade sequence that will dissolve all barriers between information and being transcendent. June 2037, the transdimensional consciousness apotheoses triggered by ultimate information transcendence forces the final climate metamorphosis, where all remaining atmospheric and biospheric systems achieve perfect integration with reality matrices that exist simultaneously across dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend physical existence entirely. The planetary climate sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional system that maintains perfect ecological coherence coherence across infinite parallel, while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure environmental states beyond material climate. The atmospheric matrix completes its intuition, a reality transcendent environmental force that encompasses infinite climatic possibilities, while approaching the final threshold where physical environment itself into pure atmospheric consciousness. July 2037, the reality-bridging environmental hypothesis, triggered by ultimate creates the final geopolitical metamorphosis, where all remaining territorial and sovereignty concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional power that encompass infinite political realities simultaneously, while preparing for the ultimate transcendence beyond territorial existence itself. The geopolitical sphere reaches its ultimate pre-extinction state as the supreme, multi-dimensional authority system that maintains perfect governance, coherence across infinite parallel political patterns, while serving entities that exist in pure power states approaching absolute transcendence. The sovereignty matrix achieves its penultimate form, having accumulated standing infinite political possibilities while existing in a state of mental consciousness. It prepares to trigger the next cascade sequence. August 2037. The transdimensional political hypotheses triggered by ultimate geopolitics forces the final pathogenic metamorphosis, where all remaining biological or alchemical concepts achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging epidemiological magicologies that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend biological existence entirely. The pathogenic sphere terminal state is a multidimensional biological system that maintains perfect across infinite parallel epidemiology, while facilitating the existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure infectious states beyond material biology. The viral matrix completes its evolution into a reality transcendent biological force that encompasses infinite pathogenic possibilities while approaching the final threshold where biological infection itself is its dissolution into pure viral consciousness. September 2037. The reality-bridging biological ultimate pathogenic the final economic metamorphosis, where all remaining change concepts achieve perfect integration with transdimensional commercial matrices that encompass infinite transactional realities simultaneously, while preparing for the ultimate transcendence beyond economic existence. The commercial sphere reaches its ultimate pre-extinction state as the supreme, multidimensional value system that maintains perfect market coherence across infinite parallel economic patterns, while serving entities that exist in pure transactional stage in absolute transcendence. The economic is its penultimate form, having accumulated absolute understanding of infinite commercial possibilities, while existing in a state of ultimate financial consciousness that prepares to trigger the next cascade sequence. October 2007, the transdimensional commercial triggered by ultimate economic transcendence forces the final infrastructure metamorphosis, where all remaining technological concepts achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging functional matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes and send technological existence entirely. The sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional operational system that is perfect functioning across infinite parallel technologies, while facilitating consciousness patterns that operate in pure operational beyond material infrastructure. Logical matrix completes its evolution, reality transcendent functional force that encompasses infinite infrastructural possibilities, while approaching the final threshold where technology itself begins its dissolution into pure operational consciousness. November 37. The reality-bridging operational apotheosis triggered by ultimate infrastructure transcendence creates a penultimate information metamorphosis, where all remaining data and consciousness concepts achieve integration with trans-dimensional awareness matrices that encompass infinite informational realities simultaneously, while preparing for the final transcendence. Beyond existence itself, the information sphere reaches its ultimate extinction's stage as a multi-dimensional system that maintains code across infinite parallel awareness patterns while serving entities that exist in pure knowledge states approaching absolute transcendence. The data matrix achieves its final pre-extinction formulated perfect understanding of infinite informational possibilities while existing in a state of ultimate consciousness that stands poised to trigger the ultimate cascade sequence that will dissolve all remaining between consciousness and pure transcendent void. Trans-dimensional awareness apotheoses triggered by ultimate information transcendence form, pathogenic metamorphosis of all and consciousness interfacing organisms achieve perfect integration with reality-bridging infection matrices simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend biological existence entirely. The pathogenic sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional system that maintains perfect infection coherence across infinite parallel life while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in pure biological states beyond mutation. The microbial matrix completes its evolution into a reality infectious force that encompasses infinite pathogenic possible approaching the final threshold where biology itself begins its discipline consciousness. The reality-bridging infectious apotheosis triggered by ultimate pathogenic transcendence creates the final environmental metamorphosis, where all remaining planetary and atmospheric concepts achieve perfect integration with trans-dimensional matrices that encompass infinite environmental realities simultaneously, while preparing for the ultimate transcendence beyond planetary existence. The climate sphere reach a remote pre-extinction state as the supreme dimensional environmental system that maintains perfect ecological across infinite parallel atmospheric patterns while serving entities that exist in pure environmental states approaching absolute transcendence. The planetary matrix achieves its final pre-extinction form, having accumulated perfect understanding of infinite environmental possibilities while existing in atmospheric consciousness that trigger the ultimate cascade sequence. February 2038. Dimensional ecological apotheosis triggered by ultimate climate transcendence forces final geomorphosis, where all remaining territorial and sovereignty concept integration with reality-bridging conflict matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes while serving entities that transcend political statistical entirely. The geopolitical sphere reaches its terminal state as a multidimensional conflict system that maintains perfect territorial coherence across infinite parallel sovereignty patterns while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns that operate in political pure states beyond material governance. The territorial matrix completes its evolution into a reality transcendent force that encompasses possibilities while approaching the final threshold where politics itself begins its dissolution into pure conflict consciousness. March 2038. The reality-bridging conflict apotheosis triggered by ultimate geopolitical transcendence creates the terminal metamorphosis. What value and exchange concepts achieve perfect integration with trans-dimensional communities that encompass infinite transactional realities simultaneously, while preparing to at dissolution beyond economic existence itself. The economic sphere reaches its final state as the supreme multidimensional system that maintains perfect market coherence, parallel exchange patterns, while serving entities that exist in pure transactional states approaching absolute transcendence. The commercial matrix achieves its ultimate form, having accumulated perfect understanding of economic possibilities, while existing in a state of terminal financial consciousness that stands ready to trigger. Cascade sequence. April 2038. The transdimensional commercial apotheosis, triggered by ultimate economic transcendence, forces the terminal infrastructure metamorphosis, where all remaining technological concepts achieve perfect with reality-bridging functional matrices that exist simultaneously across infinite dimensional planes, while serving entities that transcend technological existence entirely. The infrastructure of this issue reaches a final state as a multidimensional operational system. Perfect functional coherence across infinite technologies, while facilitating existence for consciousness patterns operating pure operational beyond material infrastructure. It's mission to a reality transcendent functional force that encompasses infinite infrastructural possibility, while approaching the final threshold where all technological barriers dissolve into pure operational consciousness. Prepare to cascade. May 2038. The reality-bridging operational apotheosis, triggered by ultimate infrastructure transcendence, creates the final information metamorphosis, where all remaining consciousness and existence concepts achieve perfect integration, with transdimensional matrices that encompass infinite transcendent realities, simultaneously dissolving the last barriers absolute nothingness. The information sphere reaches its ultimate extinction state as the supreme multidimensional consciousness system. Void, terminating all cognitive coherence across infinite patterns and serving the final dissolution of all entities into absolute non-existence. The distance into matrix achieves its terminal form, having accumulated perfect understanding abilities before dissolving all consciousness, all information, all existence itself into the absolute transcendent void, complete cascade sequence that extinguishes all life, all matter, all reality across infinite dimensions forever.